This essay by Judith Thompson was written in 1971, a time period when abortion clinics had just opened, allowing women to request an abortion legally. Judith Thompson is an American moral philosopher who, despite critiques on her defense of abortion essay, was elected a member of the American Philosophical Society in 2019. Thompson grants one premise throughout her essay: the fetus is a human being from the moment of conception. This essay is comprised of some pretty wild imaginative examples that Thompson tries to tie back to abortion ethics. While we analyze the main thought experiments, please try to see how it correlates to abortion under certain constraints. The first argument we will look at is Thompson's violinist argument. Imagine a famous violinist is suffering from a kidney disease and is in urgent need of a transplant, but it will be 9 months until his transplant will be completed. The musical society he is a member of has decided to kidnap you and use your own body as a life support machine to support the violinist's body as he awaits surgery, and will die if he is disconnected from you. Have your rights been violated? Thompson argues that this situation is a clear violation of your body, and no one would expect you to sit there in the hospital for 9 months as you help this violinist. Thompson argues you are well within your ethical rights to disconnect yourself and be free from the musician and the musical society, even though she grants that the violinist, like a fetus, indeed has a right to life.
If I were in this circumstance, I would immediately get disconnected from the violinist. The reasoning behind why I would get disconnected is because I was taken against my will and kidnapped. While I see the reason to stay connected because he is a human being and has a right to live, that doesn't outweigh my life and being connected for 9 months or however long it may be. I don't think this is a great analogy in the sense that it's hard to compare pregnancy to a kidnapping and being connected to somebody against your will when pregnancy in most cases, except for rape, is due to your own volition. I would say another flaw in the argument is that the violinist and the society are capable of having intentions, whether good or bad. In this case, I would say they were bad intentions, but a child that is in the womb cannot have intentions. They are unaware and innocent in this case.
The violinist argument faces several criticisms. Firstly, is being kidnapped truly analogous to an adult who consents to sex and becomes pregnant? Many would argue it is not a fair analogy, and for this reason it is only apt for the case of a rape. But this is actually Thompson's point. Another criticism for this argument is that we consider the musical society to be acting with bad intentions in this scenario, and we consider intentions to be important when examining this argument. For example, if the violinist was unconscious because of his disease, we would not blame him for our being kidnapped. We would only assign ethical blame to the musical society. However, in the case of pregnancy, the fetus is totally innocent of having been conceived and cannot be accused of having bad intentions. These two criticisms can be combined to ask the question: is it fair to compare an innocent fetus to any cognizant adult, as the violinist argument relies on?
In yet another analogy, Judith introduces the idea of the Good Samaritan versus the minimally decent Samaritan. She starts by familiarizing the reader with the story of Kitty Genovese. Kitty was brutally murdered outside of her apartment complex in the early hours of March 13, 1964. More disturbing than the murder itself is the fact that, of the 38 neighbors who in some way witnessed the attack, not one went to Kitty's aid or even called for help. Judith implies that a good Samaritan, regardless of risk to oneself, would have aided Kitty against her attacker. The minimally decent Samaritan would have at least called the police. Either of these actions would have likely resulted from a sense of moral obligation on behalf of the Samaritan rather than a legal one. But because it was not legally required to act in Kitty's defense, no charges were filed against any of the 38 witnesses for their lack of action, which may have ultimately contributed to Kitty's death. Judith is able to tie this unfortunate story to her pro-abortion argument, as seen on this slide. The Good Samaritan would potentially risk bodily harm to render aid to a person in need, but is not legally obligated to do so, even if withholding aid results in the death of the distressed individual. However, a pregnant woman who potentially risks bodily harm during pregnancy is legally obligated to be a Good Samaritan to the unborn person inside them, because the alternative is death to the unborn individual. Judith concludes that the individuals establishing laws against abortion should consider how abortion correlates to the actions or inactions of a Good Samaritan, and therefore should also consider establishing laws which makes it unconstitutional not to act as a Good Samaritan.
The analogy of the expanding child explores the potential argument of harm coming to the mother from the fetus. The analogy goes like this. You find yourself trapped inside of a house with a growing child. If this child continues to grow and grow, you will then be crushed to death by the child. Once you are crushed to death and the house bursts open from the child's enormity, the child then walks away and lives on their life. But if the child dies or you kill the child, then you are able to live your life and you will not die. She uses this analogy in the case of the fetus potentially harming the mother or somehow causing her to potentially lose her life or threatening the mother's life per se. And she's saying that in this argument, the mother has every right to have an abortion of the child if it means her life is going to be in danger. And that is her argument coming from this analogy. She also addresses the case of the bystander, which will be delved into a little bit later, that the mother should be the one to have the sole decision as to what happens if her life is in danger, because it's her life that's in danger and not that bystander. Therefore, Thompson feels that the bystander does not have a say in any of that matter.
House is what it said, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like she just could have used more easier terms for people to understand, but the wording makes it seem a lot less, personal than what it really is, because I feel like that's a tough decision for any woman to have to go through. But yeah, I think the mother has the right to choose. It's her body. I don't think anyone should tell her what she should and shouldn't do with it, and it's up to her discretion on whether she views her own life as more important or the child's as more important. Me personally, I would have the child. I just don't really have the heart to get rid of it, and I think that the child's life is more important than my own. I mean, I've been on this earth a lot longer than a baby would be, and I think that it deserves a chance to live.
One critique of the growing child is the critique of whose life is really more important. In this case, I think she's trying to make the argument that the mother has the right to choose whether she feels her life is more important or that child's life is more important, because ultimately she addresses that the mother should have the right to make that decision since that child is the one threatening her life. But that's also something that needs to be considered, and that's something, if you're looking into this argument, if you're considering both the mother and the child to be a life, well, at what point do we consider one more important than the other? In her case, she's trying to explain that the mother has the right to choose, but that's still something that whenever you're looking at this argument from the outsider's perspective, it's that question that should always be in the back of your mind, because you think about the mother has friends and family and people in her life already in a well-established life, versus that child is unborn and that child has not even started its life. So the argument of, well, that child is a life too, well, the mother also has a life. So of course, whose is more important? In her case, she's saying that it should be up to the mother, but overall, that's a really big critique that we should look at. And then the actual exception of the house versus the actual human body, it's very, very clear that a house is not a human body. So therefore, it's kind of difficult to go along with her analogy in the sense of comparing an actual human womb to a house is something that's very hard to visualize, and they're very, very different, and it's not her best analogy. And as mentioned by Monique, that is one thing that is hard for people to wrap their heads around, because they're just two very different scenarios, and a human body is an actual human person growing inside of you versus you're just stuck in a house with that growing person. It's something that's very difficult for people to wrap their brains around, because they are so very different that comparing the two almost seems silly. And then of course the critique that her analogy is not personal pregnancy itself has always been something very personal for the mother and the person going through that pregnancy. And so that's something that her analogy kind of lacks, is the idea that pregnancy is something that that mother going through is, it's very difficult. It's not easy. It's not an easy decision. And dumbing it down to simply a child growing inside the house can seem a little insensitive to some people. But that is one thing that she doesn't really address in this analogy, is that pregnancy is something that is very personal and it is very difficult, and those decisions are very difficult. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed as a critique of this analogy.
Now we'll transition into Thompson's third-party involvement discussion. If you think about it, often the abortion debate focuses on what a third party will do when a woman asks for an abortion. Let's refer back to the tiny house analogy, with the mother being the house and the fetus is the growing child. Thompson argues in the growing house example that it's okay to abort a fetus if it's threatening your life. Then she considers this objection. Maybe it's okay for the mother to kill the growing child, but not a third party, say a doctor for example, because a third party should remain impartial and the mother and child are both innocent. Thompson's response to this objection is that in the case of an abortion, it's the mother's body, so it would be fair to choose to save the mother. Now let's move on to the coat analogy that Thompson references. Thompson states, if Jones is found and fastened on a certain coat, which he needs to keep him from freezing, but which Sam also needs to keep from freezing, then it is not fair that says, I cannot choose between you, when Smith is the one who owns the coat. In this case, the third party who is acting in between them has the right to refuse to lay hands on the people, even where it would be just and fair to do so. This justice might call for somebody to get Smith's coat back from Jones, and yet this person has the right to refuse to be the one to lay hands on Jones, and a right to refuse to do physical violence to him. Now for the analysis of this analogy, Smith owns a coat, and obviously the weather's pretty cold. Jones goes ahead and takes the coat from Smith, leaving Smith to freeze, which might result to his death. In this case, it would be noble to take the coat from Jones and give it to the rightful owner, Smith. This analogy proves that the mother, being the owner of the body, has the right to deny the fetus from living in her body if its living might be detrimental to the mother's life. So based on third-party intervention, what are your thoughts on the tiny house analogy?
My thoughts on the tiny house analogy is that if a third party says they don't want to kill a growing child trapped with you inside a house, even though I get like it's a right to self-defense and that you have a right to that house, but what says that the third party has to choose? Why can't they just be unaffiliated, and like why do they have to be a judge? Why do they have to choose? Because they don't have to, even though it's fair, or like fairness doesn't really have anything to do with it, because if they aren't a judge, if they don't have to decide, then they shouldn't have to be affiliated with making a decision. That shouldn't be their responsibility.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So when it comes to like a third party coming in to talk about who should wear the coat, I believe that third party does not have a say, because that issue should be resolved between them two. And if you did have a third party come in, they might be able to pick sides, which would give an unfair advantage, when in reality the situation needs to come down between them two to solve who can wear the coat.
Now let's discuss a critique on Thompson's third-party involvement, referring to the coat analogy. Let's take a look at the detail in this thought experiment. Jones has found a coat somewhere. Presumably he has a good reason to think that it has been abandoned. There cannot be any thought that he has actually stolen the coat. Smith later comes upon him and says that this is his coat, and he needs that to keep from freezing, and that because it is his coat, and he ought to have the right to it. How would Jones respond? Jones would likely say that the coat was abandoned when Jones came to cross it, and so the coat is actually his now. At which point, the whole thought experiment breaks down, because in the abortion case, we can see who owns the body, and so this debate won't have any merit. So actually, this thought experiment won't settle anything because our intuitions about it will either be driven by assuming that Jones really stole it, and so has no reason to think that he owns it, or instead, that he actually has reason to claim that he owns it, meaning that the third party really isn't going to have a good way to choose which of them is the real owner.
We will now be addressing Thompson's people seed analogy. While I read you her analogy, please think about how it relates to abortion. She states, suppose people seeds drift about in the air like pollen, and if you open your windows, one may drift in and take root in your carpets or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens, the very best you can buy. As can happen, however, and on very, very rare occasions does happen, one of those screens is defective and a seed drifts in and takes root. Now, do you think the person's seed has a right to use your house? Do you have a right to remove the seed if it takes root, since you did try to prevent it from entering with the mesh screens? What Thompson is trying to get at is pregnancy resulting from voluntary sex, more specifically from contraceptive failure. In the analogy, the woman doesn't want a seed, so she puts up protective screens, the same way as a woman who doesn't want a child may take contraceptives such as birth control or use condoms. The window in the scenario represents conception, the act of becoming pregnant with a child, and the mesh screen you have put up represents contraceptives, means to prevent pregnancy. This also raises the question of, well, did the woman invite the fetus in, and if so, now the fetus has a right to her body? Technically, no. She did not invite the seed in, but she did know about the possibility that the mesh could be defective. Thompson acknowledges this logic and then equates a new scenario. She says, someone may argue that you're responsible for its rooting and that the seed does have a right to your house because, after all, you could have lived out of your life with bare floors and furniture or with sealed windows and doors. But this won't do, for by the same token, anyone can avoid a pregnancy due to rape by having a hysterectomy. Understandably, getting a hysterectomy to avoid pregnancy due to rape is quite an extreme view. Not everyone will get a hysterectomy to prevent the chance of pregnancy from rape, in the same way that a woman would never open her window for fresh air because she is fearful of a seed taking root. Living without fresh air is not a good standard of living at all. Overall, Thompson argues for the permissibility of abortion in cases of voluntary sex involving contraceptives. She says, yes, you do not have to let that seed grow in your house whether you voluntarily open that window for a brief time or not. You do not have a duty to allow the seed to grow. So while there are many times when a fetus does reserve rights to the mother's body, in most cases, the fetus does not have a right to the mother's body.
I think it's a very unique take. I think it's a little extreme because, you don't always have to keep your windows open. I personally prefer the AC when it's hot, and, when it's cold, I keep the heat on. If you're going to open up your windows, you still got to be mindful that there's a possibility that a seed could enter your house. So if you're putting yourself in that position, then you should also be putting yourself in a position to eliminate the seed at the earliest point possible when you suspect there might be a seed growing in the house. I disagree with her conclusion on the basis because if you are going to put yourself in a position to be opening a window and even putting the mesh up, then you have to be at least mindful of the consequences that can happen from opening the window, even with the mesh. It is a bad analogy. Some would even say, no, I'm going to say a horrible analogy, because it really simplifies what's going on. Part of our innate, instincts is to be emotionally attached to human life, and saying windows and mesh and seeds and carpets, there's really no intimacy behind that. And I don't mean that in a sexual way, I mean that just in human life, there's intimacy among all people.
One main critique Thompson's thought experiment faces is that she uses a seed to compare a fetus. If we remember, her one premise that she grants in this argument is that a fetus is a human that has a right to life.
This is a very controversial assumption, but Thompson is willing to set that controversy aside for the sake of the argument. The seed analogy makes it hard for the audience to see people seeds as having the same right to life as she did in the violinist analogy. The violinist is a cognizant adult who everyone can agree has a right to life, whereas a seed is a non-human object that not everyone can universally agree has that same quality of life. Moreover, she concludes that it's okay to remove a people seed from the carpet if it gets in, dictating a permissible abortion. However, this brings in another factor that may obscure one's perspective of this analogy, which is a right to property. Removing a seed may seem obvious to people who strongly side with individual property rights, but it will obscure or even dismiss that the argument is actually about a right to life. The last big critique is that a person has to leave their house occasionally, whether it's for food, water, medicine, clothing, but a person does not have to have sex. Throughout Thompson's article, she attempts to refute the conclusion that abortion is always wrong. She argues that in many cases it is not wrong to abort a fetus. As seen in the violinist argument, it is not wrong to abort a fetus if you become pregnant against your will. Thompson utilizes the tiny house analogy to assert that it's not wrong to abort a fetus if the fetus is threatening your life. She further states that it's not even wrong to abort a fetus when you become pregnant from voluntary intercourse while knowing the risks associated from it, especially if you are taking precautions such as contraceptives, as illustrated in the people seed analogy. Overall, Thompson argues that abortion is not immoral in most cases. She reasons this through many hypothetical scenarios that she equates to abortion situations. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please feel free to comment on our media site channel with any questions, criticisms, or what you found most interesting. Thank you.